Hi, everyone. Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Akshay Ananthakrishnan. He is a staff sensor engineer at IOTA Biosciences. Prior to his roles at IOTA, he was a postdoc at Dr. Doigyu Kuzum's lab at UC San Diego. He received both his MSc and his PhD at University of Pennsylvania in mechanical engineering. He also received his BE in mechanical engineering from Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani. So, can you tell us your story? I gave a brief introduction there, but I'd love to hear a bit more about your background and your journey and kind of what brought you to where you are today.
Of course. First of all, thanks, Robert and Yuching, for having me and for the introduction. I think I was a curious child, I think, since the beginning. I wouldn't say I was very different from others, but I would quite often pester my mom with a lot of questions about how things work. And so that naturally led me to science and engineering. I joined Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani, BITS Pilani for short, and realized that doing research could be a great career because it basically pays you money for asking questions. And I really liked my research experience there and the exposure I got. So worked on a bunch of different projects, mainly got to do with solar energy harvesting, and really got interested with energy harvesting, hybrid electric vehicles, and all those sort of things that are generally interesting to a mechanical engineer. I took some of that interest and I realized that I wanted to do a PhD because I really liked doing research, and that brought me to the United States. I decided to use my master's to further extend my research interests and also get to know what else is out there before I sort of zero in on my research area. So I worked with a bunch of brilliant professors on energy harvesting techniques. I also worked on some photophoretic levitation devices. So a bunch of interesting projects that really expanded my scope of research activities. While I was doing that, I took a couple of courses in MEMS, micro electromechanical systems, the entire science and art of building extremely tiny devices. And that intrigued me a lot, especially because I realized that you could build devices really small, and by virtue of being small, they can actually perform a lot better in certain aspects than conventional devices that are larger. So I was super interested in using that technology and the devices that came out of it. So decided to pursue my PhD research in that field. I met my advisor at Penn, and I got to know that some of the devices that came out of his lab, especially cardio MEMS, which later got commercialized, got acquired by St. Jude, and later now by Abbott, which is used for pulmonary heart failure device. It's a pulmonary heart failure monitoring device. It basically has been super successful commercially and just made me aware of the impact that MEMS can have in the biomedical healthcare space and the benefits you can get from really going tiny. And so I think my decision was made. I really wanted to use MEMS technologies to build medical devices. That interest became crystallized in my mind, and I joined the PhD program, worked on implantable neural electrodes, also worked on some neuromorphic computing chips. And then following my PhD, I still wasn't done with research. So I decided to continue on for a postdoc journey. I was interested in sort of pursuing a career in academia back then. So postdoc was a good and a very natural next step. I joined Dr. Dewar Kuzum's lab, where I sort of built on some of the work that was happening in the lab on neuromorphic chips, especially for spike sorting, and was very interesting project. Got to work with some amazing colleagues. By the end of it, I think my interest had slightly moved away from academia, and I was like, I wanted to give myself some time and space to understand what are the real world constraints and what is the process of translating research from lab into a commercially successful product. I'd seen some of the success in my PhD lab and what it can do to people, and I wanted to be part of that experience and also learn what are the things that go into making a medical device that is beyond just ideation, conception, and prototyping. And so that brought me to IOTA. Here I am, almost 3 years at IOTA, and I'm enjoying my role here currently.
Yeah, it sounds like it's been an awesome journey so far, and you've got to explore tons of interesting topics and tons of interesting questions and subjects. So my next question is, what sparked that initial interest and involvement in the neuroscience or neurotechnology side of things for you? Is it something that you've always been at least a little bit interested in, or is it almost like the MEMS, the study of MEMS, that kind of started leading you into that direction?
Great question. So it's, I guess it's a mix of both, but mostly motivated by a small personal story. So my grandfather had Parkinson's, and he was the first person in our family who had gotten Parkinson's. It was the first time us seeing him go through the entire journey as a patient. And so, beginning with taking pharmaceutical drugs, helping him a bit, and then eventually losing complete motor control and being, sort of completely dependent, made me acutely aware of a situation where you don't have a therapeutic option available to you, and you basically are just staring at your fate. And so, the interest really sparked there, I'd say, but it really got its form and structure when I was able to sort of learn and imbibe some of the expertise and tools to be able to build the medical devices, which is through MEMS. So I guess both of that complemented each other, but it really came from that personal experience of seeing someone go through the trouble. And while he was going through these difficulties, I happened to read and came across deep brain stimulation as one of the therapy that are offered to Parkinson's patients when they fail of conventional pharmaceutical interventions. And so, the ability to just implant electrodes inside the brain, pulse voltages or currents rather, and be able to, address problems in brain circuitry to the extent that it allows the patient to recover some of that motor loss and be able to perform well, at least for some periods of time during the day. I mean, the effect does wean off over time, but it does improve overall the quality of life. So just knowing that technologies like this, although he didn't get one, but technologies like this exist and can solve such problems was really inspiring and motivating. So that was, I'd say like a pretty important inspiration for me to pursue neurotech. Apart from that, I just had a amazing fascination, and I still do, for having, just have electrodes in the brain and to be able to record what neurons communicate. I think zooming back and looking at it as just as a spectator, sometimes not know, like this, removing yourself from the field and just looking at it from top down is like an amazing feat. It just feels like an exciting time to be in neurotech, especially with the kind of advances we're seeing over the past 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, it really is an exciting field. And that is such a personal story, your reason for getting involved. And I'm glad you got involved with the field. And I think your involvement is going to end up helping the lives of lots of people. You talked to us a little bit about your background, and it spans a lot of different fields. So you've worked on everything from neuromorphic computing. You've worked on RF analysis on military projects. You've worked on heliostat fields. You've worked on brain machine interfaces. And so I was wondering, is there like an overarching theme or overarching interest that kind of ties all these together? Or is it more so just like an effect of you learning and exploring lots of different spaces that have piqued your interest at various periods of your life?
It's a fantastic question, almost an introspective one, I'd say. If I had to sort of look in deeply, I feel like it all stems from a passion for physics, and really at the heart of it, understanding how energy can be converted from one form to another. Like using a device to be able to convert energy from one form to another, I think I find it incredibly exciting. And so when you talk about, solar heliostat fields, right? You're basically having a set of mirrors on the ground that basically just reflect light onto a point in a tower where you just have normal water. You heat the water up and you can use it for whatever purposes you want. You can use other modes of collecting that solar energy. But the whole idea that what was sunlight just sort of shining on the ground and exciting a bunch of atoms on the ground and making them vibrate more, intensely, you've sort of transformed that into, increasing temperature in water and having water molecules vibrate more intensely. And by virtue of that, you've accomplished something for yourself, something useful. I think that is incredibly powerful, that entire schematic of having a device that can just redirect energy and suddenly make it very useful. That's solar heliostat, but when energy is sort of more structured in some forms, call it information, and transforming information from one domain to the other, which you frequently do with a lot of these neural recording devices, or with neuromorphic computing, where you compute basically, still you're not technically converting energy, but you're sort of passing it through a device or a bunch of devices, and you're performing certain calculations. You're summing up energies in different fashions and you're doing certain calculations. But just transforming energy, either transducing them, adding, subtracting to them, I think I find it incredibly fascinating. And I feel like that is what underlies perhaps a lot of these projects. Though I'd say that's a reflection sort of looking backward a bit. I am a kind where I sort of like whatever I'm given. So I'm sort of open to just exploring, and whatever I take up, I just find it super interesting. Just feel like it's a question of spending enough time on a problem till you start finding it interesting. So I think it's a mix of both, but the undercurrent is energy and its transformation into various forms.
I think this personality trait that you have about you, being just very inquisitive and liking to explore and liking to understand things, can be really useful both in the science world and in the startup world. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to Yuqing now, and she's going to dive in on some of the more technical questions.
Well, one of the first thing I wanted to go over was the fact that we did throw around the term MEMS a lot. Like, it's being more well understood these days. But can you spend a few moments from both the point of view of the field at large, as well as some of the specific projects you've worked on? What is the like special power of MEMS when it comes to, like you said, power harvesting and transfer for both medical applications or something like RMs?
Yeah, great question. So MEMS stands for microelectromechanical systems. It includes devices that have characteristic dimensions, or in the microscale sort of realm. So they have, lengths on the order of, or basically device dimensions on the order of a few microns, which is like 1,000th of a millimeter generally. And they're produced using technologies that are derived from traditional semiconductor manufacturing processes. So these are fabrication processes that are used to manufacture your computer chips. So we use technologies, MEMS technologies are basically derived off of those. They use an expanded set of materials. The traditional chip manufacturing processes are a limited set of materials they work with because they need to ensure super good quality and high throughput, etc. MEMS is relaxed. You can have more exotic materials in the fray. So yeah, I mean, the advantage of MEMS is by building it allows you to build devices that are so small. And by building devices small, they have super high surface area to volume ratios. So they have very high surface areas, and those are very conducive to forming reactions, to sensing stuff. And that's what really makes it interesting for a lot of sensing and actuator applications that leverage that surface area advantage that you get from MEMS. So some of the projects, and it also, besides shrinking it down, so the project that I worked on during my PhD, where we built these implantable neural electrodes, you want them to be pretty small and as less invasive as possible so that they don't damage a lot of tissue. So you want it to be small, and MEMS was a perfect technology to be able to do that. It already existed before we did this project. Like, MEMS has been used for building microelectrodes for a while. The conventional Utah array, et cetera, are very good examples of using microfabrication or MEMS techniques to build these electrodes. But what we did slightly different was to sort of encapsulate these with natural protein materials. And the goal there was to basically have them be as biocompatible as possible, so that when the electrode enters the body doesn't see it as a separate material. It just feels it as a natural extension of itself. So we reckoned having protein on there would sort of help mimic the in vivo environment and help with the biocompatibility, which is one of the main concerns for why electrodes don't last long once they're implanted into the brain. You don't want something going in and not working and having to sort of pull it out again, and posing risk to patients. The idea was to encapsulate them. Doing those, encapsulating them with proteins with regular manufacturing techniques would mean bulking them up and increasing their footprints. And that's something we didn't want to do. So the real contribution of that project was to demonstrate a way to pattern proteins onto devices at the microscale. So to be able to put proteins on top of devices, but not bulk them up, retain that size advantage of keeping them miniaturized and small, and therefore making it less invasive, and also more sort of, taking advantage of the biocompatibility of the proteins at the same time. So we recorded spikes from rodents for I think at least a couple months. I think the project was still ongoing when I graduated, and we got very decent SNR, so very comparable with devices without those proteins. So it was really that that gap of, can you build coatings made up of natural materials that can last without sacrificing performance and footprint of the device, that we sought to address.
Yeah, that actually leads perfectly into what I was going to ask about next. So this is your paper on essentially coating the electrodes with a extracellular matrix proteins. And I was going to ask you about this because nowadays there have been a lot of work done on different biomimetic methods to make these electrodes more compatible, be that coating it with some kind of biological product that already the body wouldn't recognize as an enemy, or some companies and research labs have taken the route of making the electrodes softer, something that's closer to the mechanical properties of the brain tissue so that it would not slice through as the brain moves because it's so much harder in comparison to brain tissue. I've also heard of some papers who attach cells directly to the electrode somehow and then have cells or sometimes pieces of muscle to amplify the signal and have that be the direct interface with the brain. I was wondering if you have, having worked on that for a while, if you have any thoughts about essentially biocompatibility, making biomimetic systems.
Yeah, great questions and really great citations that you made there. I think the device that we fabricated was also flexible. It was made using perylene, like a polymer stack, and it was just about 20 microns in thickness. So it was very flexible. But with that flexibility came interesting challenges of how do you insert the devices into the brain, because they need to be of a certain stiffness to be able to enter the brain, like puncture through the dura and enter the brain reliably without sort of moving aside. So that you're able to hit your target location accurately. So we were building sort of kind of backings, stiff backings that you could then release and leave the device there and sort of things like that. I do think that it's an important consideration for biocompatibility. Biocompatibility is a very generic term, has a lot of things, sort of encapsulates a lot of things. But even remaining within that sort of amorphous framework, it is important that mechanical mismatch between device and tissue is minimized for the reasons you mentioned. So polymeric substrates are of great interest in that sense. The challenge mostly is that of lifetime. Like polymers tend to there's this problems of moisture ingress, there's problems of delamination of polymers. So I think those are the real challenges that prevent these devices from actually lasting like 5 years, 10 years, which is like commercially meaningful lifetimes. But I think there's a lot of work going on in sort of improving those, improving the adhesion properties of these polymers, as well as other alternate strategies that might require less coatings and, modifies the electrode surface as is with some patterning techniques to be able to make them susceptible to fouling over time, as well as not having coatings means not having these adhesion issues. Yep. So there are a few different routes, but I think there's a bunch of work to do before we get a very stable, chronic microfabricated interface that lives in the brain for like 5 years.
I know a lot of companies are certainly attempting it, and I suppose it's very interesting nowadays to see enough devices in patients so that we can see how a lot of these electrodes behave in humans. It's a big step upgrade from using non-human primates. Very exciting to see the data that comes out of all these. So I want to go towards the other side of what you said you've worked on, which is neuromorphic computing. I know you've worked on this in relation specifically with a neural implant with neural interface for spike sorting. I know you also done some work on a water-based long-range resistive switches, and I wonder if you can very briefly introduce the concept of neuromorphic computing, as well as how, for example, like RRAMs or resistive switches fit into this field.
Yeah, absolutely. So neuromorphic, as the name suggests, is like systems or devices basically that compute like neurons. So basically, they're electronic analogs of neurons. The idea here is that just like in biological neurons, both memory and processing happen at the same location, at the synapses. So you store information at the synapses, you also process it basically at the soma in the neurons as well as the synapses. So everything happens at the same location. Whereas in traditional computers, you have memory as a separate block, processor in a separate place, and you have to shuttle information between memory and processor to be able to accomplish your tasks. And that leads to a lot of power inefficiency because you have to constantly shuttle data back and forth. And that burden becomes exponentially more as you start to implement really large computations like matrix multiplications, which are very common for machine learning and neural network applications, right? So neuromorphic computing basically tries to leverage this property of a neuron where you can compute and store information at the same place so as to be able to do a lot of these matrix multiplication operations in parallel and not sequentially. And so that saves power and it also lowers latency. So it's really a paradigm that allows you real-time information processing at low power consumptions, which can be pretty important for brain-computer interfaces that are like especially those with high channel counts, right? That are recording data at high throughputs and you need to process them pretty fast. So spike sorting is one such algorithm where you want to look at the data that's coming in from these electrodes and be able to detect the true spikes from the ones. And you want to implement an algorithm, and those algorithms rely on various convolutions and matrix operations that can leverage these neuromorphic substrates. And what these neuromorphic substrates are, they can take on different forms. The ones I worked with was basically resistive random access memories, as it's called. And within that, there's a subset called conductive bridge RAMs. Basically, the idea is think of it as a crossbar, two metal layers just laid in a crossbar architecture, and you have resistors in between at each of those cross points. You can configure each of those resistors to be high or low or any value in between by just passing voltages or currents between select bars. Like so, if you wanted to select a particular cross point, choose the row and column corresponding to that cross point, apply a certain voltage, and you can program that resistor a particular value. If you can do that, that's basically like storing memory in a bunch of synapses. And then you can use Ohm's law to basically pass voltages and have V equals IR take care of your matrix multiplication. And so that's how you can basically accomplish just with one crossbar architecture, both memory and processing at one spot, essentially. So you can get really high density memories and computational units really for a lot of these neural network applications, which find natural applications in processing neural electrode data.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And like you said, these kinds of architectures are especially helpful for us when we're trying to design a very compact system that uses as little power as possible. I know you used neuromorphic computing chips as part of a project you were working on. So this ties in like both sides of something. You worked on the material side and making sure that the biocompatibility bio and electronics interface well. And then there's also the very compute heavy side. What was it like kind of transitioning from one project to the other into something that kind of is all inclusive of a project in your postdoc?
Yeah, great question. I think it gave me a very well-rounded perspective of both sides of the equation because you want to be aware of what happens to the data that's being collected, and you don't want to build a device. Just focus on the device itself and not focus about the processing bits, which can be bottleneck at some point. So you want to know the entire system or at least have an experience of what's happening in different parts. And I think that was my rationale for basically dabbling with both neuromorphic computing as well as the neural electrodes bit. Even the neuromorphic computing, I mean, the projects I worked on the materials we used had required a lot of engineering, device engineering to get them to work. I think the materials we use now for, at least the ones we use, like we use copper oxide for building these RRAMs. I think they still need a fair bit of engineering to sort of make them repeatable and last a lot of cycles, like, conventional flash and other memory technologies, they can last for a lot of time. Are getting there. I mean, I think there's been significant improvements over the past few years, but I think there's a lot more work to do in terms of materials, in terms of architecture. There's some problems regarding programmability, like storing information. For instance, if you want to store information in these crossbars, sometimes depending on the architecture you choose, it can sort of depend on the kind of data you store. So some data patterns may be easier to store, some other data patterns may be more difficult to store, and you don't want that kind of dependency. You should be able to store whatever data you want on the substrate, and for that you would have to think about from a device perspective, how to improve materials, and you also have to think strongly about architecture. So it's a known problem in the field, and there have been like very interesting and emerging ideas for how to tackle that. But for me, it was like really a holistic experience of being able to look at devices that really listen to neurons and generate data, and then also be able to work on stuff that takes that data, ingests that data, and converts it into something that's really a higher level. And so, yeah, getting exposure to both sides of that pipeline was pretty eye-opening, frankly.
And just to hop in with a quick follow-up question here, you had mentioned that on these crossbars, at least at the current state of the art, there's certain types of data that are better suited for getting stored on these crossbars. And I was wondering if you could dive in a little bit deeper on that and maybe just expand on like what sorts of data types are better suited for these frameworks and what are some of the roadblocks to further innovation, making it a little more data type agnostic.
So generally, I think it's a trade-off between how much of computation do you want to pack in 1 square centimeter of a chip versus the fidelity of data you want to store in that chip. So by that, let me explain that a bit better. There are two types of architectures. One is that relies on purely on resistive devices. So it does not have any transistors for selecting certain lines. So you can use transistors to basically select certain cross points much more effectively. That is, if you have transistors, it's called a 1T, 1R configuration. So you have one transistor, one resistor, and the transistor allows you to select that particular resistor and program it to whatever value you like it. But having transistors means transistors are 3-terminal devices. Resistors are 2-terminal devices. So if you introduce transistors into the architecture, you start consuming a bit more space so your footprint becomes larger. So if you use only resistors, you run into the problem of not being able to select a resistor specifically and program it efficiently. So when you try to select a particular resistor, if there's a resistor nearby that's already in high conductance state, your current might just sneak through that resistor and flow out, and you may not be able to, you may misprogram or not program the resistor you wanted to program. So this is called a sneak path issue. It's pretty common for architectures that only utilize resistors. So you can get really high computational densities with these because resistors are 2-terminal devices, and you can have just many cross points locked into 1 square centimeter area of the chip. By programming it can become tricky, especially if neighboring cells start becoming become conductive. So if the pattern of data you're storing is such that the cell that you want to program is low and the neighboring cells are highly conductive, current would rather flow through the nearby cells than flow through the cell you want it to flow through. So being able to sort of control current distribution in that array can become a lot more challenging when you don't use transistors. So there's basically a trade-off of the number of transistors you use to the kind of data fidelity you want. So I think there's some work on the architecture side, and then some of it could be mitigated by using different resistance ranges and a different programming scheme. So I think some level of work on the materials front, on the device itself, and some architectural level innovations that sort of better balance that trade-off could help address that problem and maybe land us in a more sweeter spot.
Thanks for expanding on those details about it and explaining that side of things to us.
I was wondering, when you say, so you guys fabricating these crossbar arrays in the lab?
Yep.
That was more like on the semiconductor side, right? Or did any of your MEMS fabrication experience transfer, or is like you said, MEMS often uses a different array of materials, more polymer based or otherwise? How did any of that transfer or help with the semiconductor fabrication?
Yeah, great question. So I think you can think of MEMS as like being able to do sort of borrowing from the conventional semiconductor fabrication technology, sort of using all of that, and plus having other exotic materials in the mix. So being exposed to MEMS meant that I was able to understand the conventional deposition techniques, how to deposit materials, how to etch materials, how to use light to pattern different materials, and all of that knowledge could be transferred or used as is for fabricating these devices, because we were using copper oxide, we were using gold metal layers, and all of the processes to pattern them, deposit them, etch them. The tools we use, the processes we use were identical or similar. So a lot of the knowledge that exists was common. So the transition was fairly straightforward, I guess.
Yeah, and I think personally, I was very excited to discover that the field in the past while has kind of taken all these semiconductor technologies and then been able to advance very quickly and make very small devices, which is very helpful when we're interacting with the size scale of a single neuron, etc. So we covered neuromorphic computing for kind of in detail as well as RM. I was curious, in terms of steps forward for the research in the field that you did for your postdoc, do you envision, you mentioned the material side of the RM can be improved for this, as well as architecture side. What about interfacing the neuromorphic computing strategy specifically for neural implants? Do you think they have more hurdles to cross than traditional computing? This is for perhaps a situation where we're not really worried about power. Like I think in the experiment, you guys had the animal is tethered, so power is not as big an issue. What do you think are the challenges going forward?
Yeah, I guess it's a good question. I really think it boils down to building larger crossbar arrays. Like, can you build large crossbar arrays with high fidelity and being able to program them efficiently? I think several groups at UCSB and other groups at Michigan have shown that it's possible, but may require the implementation of a transistor, may require other additions. So it's basically about being able to cater to the high channel count that's coming from your neural implant device and be able to interface with it efficiently, and the kind of algorithms you can run on it. I think it's especially suited to matrix multiplication. So if you're doing specific sort of spike sorting algorithms, sure. Or if you can sort of map your algorithms to, or part of your algorithms that rely on matrix multiplications, I think the hardware can be very useful and can be, I don't see any direct problems in interfacing neural implants with neuromorphic computing per se. No evident technological bottlenecks I can think of, but I may be wrong. I also wanted to touch upon, I think you asked me at some point about water-based RMs, and I know I probably didn't answer that. So that was one project during my PhD where we were more exploratory, and we were thinking about just the brain architecture. And there's some great work by Daniel Bassett's lab at Penn. They work on brain architectures and have fascinating papers on these. Essentially, the brain seems to adopt a small world architecture, which means that it has a bunch of really dense connections and also sparse ones. The dense connections help it do a lot of the functions, like it's functional in nature, and the sparse ones basically help with manage power efficiency. So it's really efficient way. Like if you had only sparse connections, you wouldn't have a lot of functionality. But if you had only dense connections, you'd have a lot of functionality, but you'd be really inefficient in terms of power consumption. So the brain balances it pretty beautifully by having this, small world architecture where it has clusters of really highly densely, connected networks. And those individual subnetworks are sparsely connected with each other through these highways. So our thought was like, the conventional neuromorphic chips which are being fabricated using traditional MEMS or semiconductor fabrication techniques, are built layer by layer, have very nice structure to them, but it's really difficult to build these long-range connections because that requires you to be able to form connections between two metal lines that are very far apart. That means whatever stuff is in between should be able to conduct ions or whatever material, across the synapse, and leads to really planar configurations. And if you had to build volumetrically, you have to basically stack all of these layer by layer and build up an entirely volumetric device for computing. And the prevailing thought at that time was, could you leverage water or any liquid medium, because it naturally it's naturally conducive to ionic movements and ionic conduction, and can allow for long-range transport, and therefore allow for these sparse long-range connections. So could you leverage water as a medium for storing information and basically facilitating this artificial synapse function, both storing and processing information? And so that led to this water-based RRAM. So we just took two metals, dunked them in water, and basically applied potentials, and we could really grow filaments and disconnect them, essentially being able to store a 1 and 0 in water on demand. And you could actually retain information even when you disconnected power. So it's a non-volatile memory storage device, and it could do some basic, basic logic computation. We imagined, like, I guess the way it exists right now, not suitable anywhere. It's not anywhere close to a product, but I think sort of offers an intriguing view into building volumetric computational systems instead of looking at things just as planar systems and building on them to, get volume. How about sort of sacrificing some of that precision that's inbuilt into these manufacturing techniques, be a little imprecise, and have things placed at arbitrary distances, but in a volumetric fashion, and have a lot of them by virtue of being imprecise, and then maybe use an algorithmic setup for programming these connections and implementing the kind of algorithms you want. So that was I think the first step in that direction was to demonstrate circuits as well as devices that may be amenable to this kind of approach, and the water-based RRAM sort of fit into that project.
I have a follow-up to that. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges for applying this kind of new thought process to designing architectures? Is it just that it's less practiced, and you guys demonstrating this will hopefully introduce this as a more common idea? Or were there some, I suppose, like technical difficulties in fabricating devices such as this? Doesn't sound very easy to encapsulate droplets of water in semiconductors when they often have to go to very high temperatures during fabrication.
Yeah, great question. I think it was less practice. I think there's more work in that area in trying to use hydrogels, water, or soft materials to be able to do these kinds of computations. I think that being able to the work we did relied on passive devices, because passive devices are two-terminal devices, and these devices you can really throw them up and build connections very quickly in a three-dimensional manner. But building architectures solely from two-dimensional or two-terminal devices rather means that you're building a really dissipative system. And so being able to compute with a dissipative system is non-trivial. So we showed with some circuit and some circuit simulation studies that you could build a shallow neural network that does a digit classification task. But if you wanted to build a deep neural network, you would require some three-terminal devices to periodically add gain to your signal and keep preserving your signal. And so being able to incorporate three-dimensional devices in this volumetric fashion, that's a challenge. Because you can think of a two-terminal device just formed by the virtue of throwing a bunch of wires in a three-dimensional liquid by forming it at the intersection points. But a three-terminal device requires proper arrangement and requires a little more alignment. And so how do you introduce gain into the system without sacrificing the core philosophy of being able to build volumetrically? I think that is a tough challenge. So I think you would have to look at it from a modeling perspective, look at it from an architecture perspective, and at the same time, look at it from a fabrication perspective. From an architecture perspective, maybe ask the question, what's the minimum number of transistors, minimum number of three-terminal devices I need to accomplish this? And then think about ways in which you can non-deterministically place them in a volume configuration and then programmatically connects them. Even the programmatic connection is quite a difficult challenge. How do you address them without being able to access them if they're buried deep inside the volume? So there are some very fundamental questions there, but I think really exciting ones, I think, to ponder over and maybe explore.
Thank you for giving such an in-depth overview of that. And I think clearly you're very knowledgeable about this field. And I think it's very cool that you guys got to do this kind of exploratory work, and hopefully that inspires more people to think non-planarly and think in other dimensions. I wanted to start to pull back and going back to neural interfaces, as well as just looking at the difference between transitioning from academia to industry. And you mentioned before at some point that you discovered that you wanted to focus on an industrial career instead of academic. What was the trigger point, or what led to that decision?
Yeah, great question. It did require some reflection on my end when I made the decision, for sure, because I wanted to be in academia. But at the same time, I sort of see it as a trade-off. I guess in academia, for most parts, I can't generalize this to all labs, but I think for the most parts, you are motivated by curiosity to sort of explore and try different ideas. You could also be motivated by actual market needs and build towards that, or you can start from curiosity and then tailor that project towards market. So there's multiple instances. The Toyota is one where it came out of a lab and then took on a startup form and is aiming for commercialization. So that can happen, but I think most of the labs start from a curiosity-driven place. Whereas in industry, it's basically very market focused. The decisions, et cetera, are more constrained. So when I was working in academia, I almost felt like I was getting the ideation, the curiosity-driven research kind of picture, but I wasn't fully understanding everything that it takes to get a device to market. And somewhere I wanted to sort of see what that process looked like, or at least experience it. Maybe going forward, I might switch back to academia at some point when I feel like I'm super interested. And now I have a sense of both worlds. I could sort of have a better idea of what it takes to translate idea from academia to industry. So I felt like having just one side of that puzzle figured out, I was curious to get to the other side and know what are the factors that can constrain or prevent a device from getting into the market. And surely I've learned a lot of that over the past 2 or 3 years. Like you could have a brilliant device, but there can be so many business risks. There can be clinical factors that play into your decision making. It's not just having a great technology. And I think understanding or sort of having a sense of those factors was important. And I think if I had to go back into academia now and sort of build a program, I think it would be more informed and hopefully lead to more translational products. And I think that kind of mentality or thinking has been more influenced by my PhD group, because I think given that we've had like 2 or 3 spin-offs from our lab. I think that has really influenced the way I think about academia and how I potentially, if I do go back, want to contribute. So it was really sort of trying to understand the whole picture.
Up on what you mentioned about kind of tying in translation as well as thinking of market needs as well as patient needs when developing a product like this. Broadly speaking, for someone, for example, for students who are in college right now who are interested in deciding between one or the other, what would you say are some things you've noticed in terms of, for example, working in industry? How much of the decision making of the direction of the company or the focus of the device, at what stage is that decided, or can it still change like halfway through the startup? And how much is the engineering team involved in versus the business team involved?
Great question. I think all of those pieces have a role to play. And ideally, all of those happen like in a coordinated fashion. In its initial days, I mean, and this I'm talking about of a traditional startup. IOTA, in a sense, when I joined IOTA, it was already acquired by Astellas, and so it was no longer under the same funding pressures or the financial pressures that a typical startup would feel. So I'm probably not as qualified to speak about those situations, but I will say that for a typical startup, I think initially you really want to have some product come into the market. You want to have some prototype to showcase some technology. So there may be a bias on engineering, there may be a bias on the device side or on the technology side, but it can't be without understanding basic needs. Because I think at the end of the day, you're selling a business proposition, and that hinges on addressing a societal need. And if you don't have that figured out to at least with a certain degree of clarity, that's going to cause problems. And I think that becomes exponentially more important as you continue to work on your device or your technology. So ideally, you start involving clinicians, you start involving patients, you start involving the business voices as early as possible in the process, so that you don't design for the wrong thing and end up in a situation where you're solving a need that's not there, or you're solving a need in a manner that doesn't agree with all the stakeholders. So you want to hear all of those inputs and all those voices as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's incredibly insightful. And I think I completely agree. It is a business after all. And while a lot of research can be more reliant on curiosity as well as scientific development, the role of companies and startups, etc., is to be need finding and need solving. And having access to clinicians and patients very early on is pretty crucial to success. And I think that will be wrapping up some of our technical questions, and something that, extremely broadly speaking, for the neurotechnology field in general, would you, as someone who has worked across materials, MEMS, and even like microarchitecture design, would you say that the field needs more of a specific expert in a specific discipline? And why would you say so?
What a great question. Not sure I'm entirely qualified to answer this, but I can give you my 2 cents on how I see it. I think I see two sorts of problems. One being biology focused, like our lack of understanding of biology. And two is our ability to not create or understand the technology we're building. So basically technological barriers or biology understanding barrier. I've seen both. And I think both are important. So I think obviously companies that are working in the neurotech space do have neuroscientists, et cetera, inform the kind of problems we're working on. But there's, I think, some areas where we have a fundamental lack of understanding of what are disease pathologies or what are actual sources for the problems we're trying to solve. And so I think that can lead to a situation where the solutions are suboptimal or not targeted well enough. The second piece is what I can speak to a little more is the technology piece. And I think in the technology piece specifically, I think understanding the interface between device and tissue or device and the biological surrounding, I think that is an area that would benefit from having a lot more understanding. If we get to a point where we can build models of these interfaces, we do have models already, but unfortunately, there can be substantial variations, and it's not entirely robust. Let's just put it that way. But if we had something that a tool or a model that's able to sort of faithfully produce or allow us to sort of capture that interface effects, I think it will lead to a design of better and more innovative devices, because one can then start basically looking at the interface as a black box with a set kind of properties. I'm sort of suggesting really ideal situations here, but being able to simulate it like you do circuits, and we do have circuit representations, but like I said, they're not entirely precise. So being able to work on them and build really precise circuit models for interfaces and being able to use that to engineer devices, I think would be really, really, really impactful.
Definitely. hope to see a future where we can just go online and I can download a model of the brain and then run simulations as if I were just using resistors and capacitors.
Exactly.
Do you think these kinds of developments are going to have to come from academia, or both things you mentioned are, I believe, more on kind of the discovery side? It's not tied into a specific product unless it is a product for neuro research groups and companies. Do you think it would be more likely that it would be more fitting for a company or research lab to tackle something like this?
Ideally, a collaboration between the two would be the best, but those collaborations can be tricky, academia, industry collaborations. But if it does happen, I think that will be great. A world where we could do, like, just as we do piece-by simulations for understanding circuits, something like that, a tool, an open source toolbox for doing that, I think would be great. I feel like some research institutes and academics and in universities may be already equipped to do, or at least start initiatives on this and get folks from industry to start to contribute in whatever way they can in helping build this framework. I think an initiative that like that would like help the community immensely. That's just my opinion.
And hopefully those tools aren't that far along the way, because we are starting to see a lot more influx of data from collected by devices and patients themselves. So hopefully that will kind of accelerate the process. If a student in undergraduate or someone who is not in the neurotech field wants to kind of get involved, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I can sort of speak from my experience, and what's benefited me the most over the years, I think, is asking, like being super curious. Curiousness, you're asking a lot of questions, knowing exactly what you don't know, and not trying to use, like when you read papers or read stuff, mistake jargons for the fact that you know something. I think I've seen that as a stumbling block for myself, and I've had to overcome that. Is sometimes when you read something and you feel like you can substitute that with the jargon, you almost have a automatic sense of feeling that you know the thing, but you don't actually know it. So start trying to avoid jargons, really asking questions deeply and knowing what you don't know so that you know what questions you can ask. I think those are important. As you keep asking questions, you will learn how to organize your questions and how to order them. And eventually, let's say you want to solve a particular problem or understand a particular topic in your tech. You asked 50 questions to really understand that topic. I think with time, that number might come down to 30 or 25 because you would have understood how to order your questions properly. Initially, you were a little more all over the place. You ask questions like every which way and you're not very structured. Over a period of time, you start to gain a sense for what that structure should be, and you will ask questions in a manner that will allow you to learn new topics much faster. And then you start enjoying the process of really asking questions and learning. And then you're also somewhat agnostic to what you're learning. You can learn whatever you want as long as you have the basic framework of how to learn, which is basically how you want to ask questions. So I do feel like focusing on being really curious, not worrying about where can I make, like I think you have the motivation to make impact, but focus on upskilling rather than trying to make impact directly. Try to get your fundamentals right, very first principles thinking, and really learn the art of asking questions. I read somewhere like a smart person can answer a question, but a wise person can ask the right question. So I think the onus on asking questions, placing more onus there, I think will help.
Certainly. And I think that's great advice, especially on, I feel like I sometimes also fall into the trap of jargon. Like you said, tying back to the idea of you have to understand basic principles. Your passion for physics and energy drove you down this path. And it is often, I think, probably a good idea to, like you said, ask the right questions and be able to break a concept down, almost trying to explain it to yourself as if you were, I don't know, like a teenager or someone who did not know the field. As long as you're able to explain it clearly and not kind of rely on big terms, that's a good way to understand things. That's very good advice.
Exactly. And you also know the limits to your understanding. You know that, if I go 4 layers, 5 layers deep into this idea, like down to a neuron, I don't understand further what happens inside the neuron. And now that's an opportunity for you to ask more questions and learn more. So gradually build that tree to be as deep as possible. And then you will have a framework for yourself for, thinking about ideas. And I think that naturally spawns a lot of creative ideas if you have that framework built in a very solid manner.
Yeah, and I think that's really insightful advice, not only for students, but for just about everyone. And honestly, I think I'm going to try to take some of that advice to heart as I move forward, because I think I kind of fall into that jargon trap that you guys mentioned sometimes as well. And so to zoom out even further, you're deeply involved in the field of neurotechnology at this point. And so I was wondering, do you have any predictions for that field at large over perhaps the next 20 years or so?
Putting me on the spot now, but I think I can share with you what my hopes are. My hope is that in the next 20 years, we would have addressed Parkinson's, that we would have addressed Alzheimer's, and found a very good way to treat clinical depression, I think, or psychiatric disorders just generally. I think addressing these spaces this is from a therapeutic standpoint. I think addressing these spaces in the next 20 years, I think is important alongside, of course, cancer. I think, but since we're in this topic of neurotech, I feel like these are the three major problems I think I hope we address in the next 20 years. On the diagnostic side, I feel like more awareness, and maybe this is not technology or prediction related, but I think a society that's more aware of the role of diagnostics and prevention and not overly dependent on therapeutics or like, I'm not saying therapeutics is not important, but I'm saying also emphasizing the need for prevention would be great. It puts a lot of stress on the healthcare system when you're only resorting to the last line of treatment. When you've got a problem and then you have to rush, but it would significantly help your lifespan, your quality of life, if you can rely on prevention and rely on diagnostics. So I think develop a society where I think we have a more ingrained culture of sort of testing ourselves and diagnosing diseases, and also having the tools and technology to do that, to be able to diagnose diseases, especially the four horsemen of death, cancer, atherosclerosis, neurodegenerative diseases, and diabetes, or any foundational disease like diabetes, could be fatty liver, and these kinds of diseases, metabolic disorders, which can ultimately take various forms. I think being able to diagnose them early, technologies to be able to do so, as well as the mindset in society to be able to take this as the first step, I think that would be great. That requires some sort of awareness programs and channels to do that. And that's what the second part of this, the diagnostic part, is what I gathered from Peter Attia's book. I think Outlive, it's called. It's a fantastic read. It has a lot of useful information on the current healthcare system and what healthcare, he calls it healthcare 2.0, I think, and how healthcare 3.0 should look like. And its emphasis on prevention and what it can do for us. Yeah, more awareness, more tools for testing, and hopefully addressing the three main diseases that I can think of: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and depression. I think would be up in my bucket list.
Yeah, I think first off, that's a beautiful vision for the future. I really hope that humanity and innovation kind of goes in that direction too. I think it's definitely possible, but need some things to go right. We need some luck, and we need a little bit of a culture shift as well. And so another follow-up question I had, and I'll definitely check out that book that you just mentioned there, but do you have any other book or media recommendations for our listeners? And they could be neuroscience related, but don't necessarily have to be.
Yeah, I read books and patches, so I'm a bit disorganized that way. But I think I really like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, System 1, System 2 thinking.
It's a very good one.
Yep. Build by Tony Fadell is also really good for people who are working on devices and want to learn how to build devices. And I think there's another book called CEO Excellence. I forget the name of the authors, but they really lay out what are the essential traits for business leaders, or the common traits that they've observed in business leaders in how they make decisions. And I think in many ways we're CEOs in our own worlds. And I think decision making is something all of us do on a moment to moment basis. And so being able to sort of learn from some of those principles and adapt and imbibe them and know, structured, make decisions in a more structured manner would help. At least that's what I feel. So I try to read those books and try to imbibe as much as I can. Although I will agree, like I said, I'm a bit of a patchy reader, so perhaps I should form a habit of reading books in its entirety.
Yeah, I mean, those sound like awesome recommendations, and I'll be sure to check those out. Is there anything that we didn't discuss today that you'd like to bring up?
Not really. I think we covered a range of topics. And thank you guys for sort of inviting me, and also had so much fun discussing a whole range of thoughts and my experiences. And I hope, this leads to more conversation.
Another quick question before we sign off. Should our listeners contact you for further discussion after the episode? And if so, what sorts of things would you want to be reached out to about? And what's a good way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm generally excited about a lot of things in the healthcare space, definitely. I'm also very interested in climate change. I feel like these are the two main problems. And coincidentally, some of my work in solar energy, climate. I like that space. Still connected with that. I at least try to read and keep in touch. Healthcare for sure. So if there are questions, suggestions, ideas, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn, and I'll be more than happy to chat with you about it. For certain topics, I can share my experience and maybe share my expertise. In other topics, I can be a good student and learn from you. So I'd appreciate any of the two.